Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brainmap. This seminar series is co-sponsored by P41-funded Center for Meso-Scale Mapping, housed in Martinos Center. Before we start, I would like to remind our audience that tomorrow in the Dome at 8:30 a.m., Neuroscience Grand Rounds will be given by Alexandra Golby from BWH. So if anyone wants to go, please put that in your calendars. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Dr. Francis Shen. Dr. Shen is an associate professor at the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical and Department of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, and a Harvard, the university-affiliated professor at the Harvard Law School. Previously, he was a professor at University of Minnesota Law School and graduate program in neuroscience. Shen Lab at the Harvard explores the emerging intersection between law, ethics, and neuroscience and AI. The lab motto is, every story is a brain story. Dr. Shen has co-authored 3 books, including the first law and neuroethics casebook, and published articles on a range of neurolaw and neuroethics topics, including neuroimaging research ethics, computational phenotyping, portable neuroimaging, memory and lie detection, cognitive neural enhancement, criminal justice, brain injury, evidentiary admissibility, sports concussion, juror decision-making, criminal mental states, dementia, and mental health. He is currently leading a creation of a Dana Foundation's career network in neuroscience and society, and co-leads projects on portable MRI and the ethics of digital phenotyping in psychiatry, pursuing neurotech justice, and improving neuroscience training for judges. In 2021, he was awarded Early Career Scholars Medal by the Academic Law Institute, one of the 2 medals awarded of law and neuroscience. He received his BA from the University of Chicago, his JD from Harvard Law School, and his PhD from Harvard University. I would like to remind our audience to ask their questions at the end by raising their hands, and for the virtual people in the Q&A boxes as well. Dr. Shen, thank you very much.
Okay,
and the virtual stages. Oh, well, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching. And there'll be a lot of time for questions at the end. I'll talk for maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll get into it a little bit. So I want to talk about neuroethics for neuroimaging. And I want to pick a couple of issues that are, I think, pretty general across most neuroimaging modalities. That is tracking down representative and diverse participants for human neuroimaging research. But I'll touch on a bunch of other things as well. And my thought is that I don't know there's ever been another, kind of neuroethics talk in the series. So thanks for doing that. So I'll also give you like an intro to neuroethics along the way. All right. No disclosures, thanks to all the funders, including Dana and NIH, others. Here's what we'll do. I'm going to give you the punchline first, talk about the work I do. I will ground this in some history, which is a reminder that good intentions aren't enough. Deep dive onto these definitional, conceptual questions and then practical questions of bias, diversity, representativeness. Reality check about what do you do when you don't have representative data, whatever that means. I'll talk about 2 case studies, which include colleagues here at MGH and Harvard, and then a few thoughts about where we go from here, including mention of another collaboration with Martinos. So let's just cut to the chase. The punchline, this is by Neuroethics Street. If you have never taken it, it's not too far away. It's very nice, Neuroethics Street. Sometimes, though, people are afraid to go down it because they think it's neuroethics police. That ethics is like the IRB, and the only reasons that they're there are to prevent you from doing what you want to do. It's a speed bump, a roadblock, and something to be dreaded. And if there's nothing else today, I hope I can convince you that's not the case. In fact, I would suggest that strong neuroethics in collaboration with strong science produces better outcomes overall. And neuroethics is really about, it's a fancy word, reflexive. The simple version is that you think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you care about, and does what you're doing align with the values that your lab and you have as a scientist? I think neuroethics also helps us see that the work you're doing, even though it may seem several steps away, isn't happening in the abstract or in a vacuum. It's created in a certain ethical, legal, social, political, cultural context. So here's the one question. Martinos is already the world leader in neuroimaging. I don't have the citation for that, but I think we all agree, right? So let me plant a seed. Can it also become the world leader in the neuroethics of neuroimaging? I know my answer, but I'll give it to you at the end. All right, so just broadly, neuroethics is a term, but I'm going to use it as a catch-all to think about a whole bunch of issues, including equity and diversity and inclusion and legal, but I'll just use the word neuroethics. All right, so what do we do in my lab? It's a different kind of lab from the labs that you have here. We focus on law, ethics, neuroscience, and AI. Our motto is, so saying, is every story is a brain story. There are two caveats to that, both of which drive most of our work. One is that every story is, or at least many, are poorly understood brain stories. And that uncertainty, that is knowing something but not enough, turns out to have major implications in the ethics and the legal domain, because it's not the case that you can simply, in that last paragraph, be like, more research necessary and more funding for that research necessary. In the worlds I operate in, a decision has to be made under uncertainty. And of course, many of your worlds as well. The second is that every story is not just a brain story. This isn't a neuroreductionist presentation, social story, historical story, a philosophical story, but it's certainly a brain story. We've got two big questions, basically arrows going both ways. One is, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in this building in neuroscience and AI. What are its implications for the law and for society? How does better understanding of brain-mind behavior relationship maybe lead to more effective and just legal systems? Of course, there's deep ethical question along the way, but there's also law and ethics have this unique position that we play a role in what research you can do and how you can conduct your research. And so we play a role there too. How can the legal and ethical governance of these technologies, I like this word, unleash the power of what you're doing, not get in the way, but at the same time, promote values that many of us care about? And this raises the question, well, what do we care about? What are our ethical commitments and how would we go? We do a lot of like traditional, we do hypothesis testing and run big surveys and we do that kind of stuff. But we also do a lot of outreach and education work, community engaged research. We collaborate a lot. I joke that when I travel, I don't pick up souvenirs. I come home with new co-authors. So watch out. I'm not going to talk about everything we do, but we do a lot of things from aging brains to baby brains to stuff in the courtroom to stuff in sports concussions and all kinds of stuff. I just want to flag one other MGH group called the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior through MGH Psychiatry. And I was the executive director of this center for 3 years and then handed it off. Our motto there was better decisions aligned to science. We think can produce better outcomes aligned with justice. I think that extends beyond the law. All right, so that's a little bit about what I do in my orientation to this. I want to start with a lesson, hopefully a sobering lesson from history. This is going to be about psychosurgery, so it's more intervention than imaging, but the story I think is a good one for us to listen to. So, and this is specific to the criminal justice system, this example, but it could be applicable in other spaces as well. One colleague has said that history has shown us the repeated policy failures of a biologically based approach to criminal justice. Did you remember my slide before? Like, hey, we're learning this cool stuff in neuroscience, let's apply it in the law. Many think that is basically the worst thing ever, and they've got good reason to think so. And so a central challenge is, do we learn from this history? So just to kind of set it up, there have been a lot of scholars and clinicians who are interested in the violent brain. Be interested in it today because it's really continues to be a hot topic, especially in urban cores, including this city, Chicago, was the issue in the mayoral election of this week. And so colleagues at University of Pennsylvania, Adrian Raine, neurocriminologist, wrote a book in 2013, The Anatomy of Violence. He used PET scanning primarily, scanned those who had been murderers and controls and tried to see what is the neurobiological and genetic underpinning of them. What I want to point out is that 40 years before, the very same work was happening right here at MGH. Vernon Mark, Frank Irvin led a project on violence in the brain. It was prominent. It made the cover of Fortune magazine. They were featured in People. And they did research that today would not be allowed. And I think that's a good thing. Let me just show you the research so we know what happened. The idea, again, was motivated by altruistic reasons. It is, they looked around them And they saw that we had an intractable social problem, interpersonal violence. And a whole bunch of, say, more than a century of social interventions had been tried, one after another, didn't seem it would work. So they said, well, we know that behavior and these decisions to do bad things to others are somehow rooted in the brain, right? That's the premise of, of this entire operation we're doing. So what if we could find the violence center and cut it out? Psychosurgery. But you've got to find the center first. So they use deep brain stimulation. They'd have patients like this. There's a famous figure from their book or from their research, Julia in a pleasant mood before deep brain stimulation. They targeted the amygdala. They used remote control brain stimulation technology in the 1960s. It was developed by Dr. Delgado at Yale. They press the button, and then when they press, they send patients like Julia into a rage state. These are humans, right? Again, altruistic, because if they could find, and they really, again, focused a lot on the amygdala, this place, they would cut it out. Now, psychosurgery quickly went away, but not without making headlines and causing congressional investigations. I just want to set that context. It's a great book called Mind Stealers if you want to know all the details. There are also civil lawsuits against MGH, which we don't go into. But I just flagged this. It was a moment where scientific rationale was being used for critical dilemmas of the day. Follow the science. There was a rising tide of violence. There was public demand for speedier solutions to crime. There was a burning desire for national tighter budget. And this is 1978, but sounds very familiar. And so, with the here comes psychosurgery. I just want to flag one last historical example. You guys know this device. That's the prefrontal. That's the device that would facilitate the prefrontal lobotomy. Moniz wins a Nobel Prize for that. And of course, when you say lobotomy now, you sort of think, oh, okay, no. Though it is still used in a few rare instances. What you don't know is that the criminal justice system thought this was an awesome idea. So here's a quote from the Yale Law Journal that time: "Perfection of so relatively simple and inexpensive a technique as the prefrontal lobotomy promises to be a major contribution to the cure of criminals." Thankfully, it was not used at scale, but it was thought to, and it was used in some smaller instances. And again, this is the challenge. Every story is a poorly understood brain story. So who are you going to trust? Well, Yigas Moniz says, I don't know, I've got this one credential. It's called a Nobel Prize, right? Again, great intentions. And thankfully, again, in neither of those cases, widespread use, but the potential was there. So it's just to keep us humble. It's not to suggest that we're going down that path, but is to say that you could if you're not careful. All right, well, one way to be careful, and this has been in the multiple literatures, not just neuroscience, across the biomedical sciences, including AI, is the idea that we ought to have representative data sets, diverse and representative data sets. It is all over the place, this kind of language in neuroscience and beyond. But there's a real challenge, which is that nobody knows what it means to have a representative data set, or what a biased data set looks like, or what it means to be diverse. So I'm not going to tell you, because defining these things is, I think, actually impossible outside of context. Why? Well, one reason, I won't go through all the details, but it's this: that bias has many different normative meanings across many different areas. There are certain circumscribed statistical bias measures that might be appealing in one context, but these words and these concepts float between disciplines, across funders. It's really complicated. That doesn't mean that we can't think carefully about it. So let me walk through an example of one way we can think about it. So first of all, some good but very complicating news is that a lack of diversity on a given dimension in training data doesn't necessarily mean it will be biased with respect to its outcomes in that dimension. And here's an example also from colleagues at MGH Harvard. So many of you may, I don't know if some of you know this work. Multi-institutional validation of mammography-based breast cancer risk model. Without going into any of the technical details, the basic idea is you want to use imaging to identify earlier rather than later the possibility or likelihood of breast cancer. So you develop that model with a non-representative training data set, the people who come to MGH studies, right? And then you say, well, let's go out, as they did, to many other countries, many other centers, a total in this case of over 120,000 mammograms, 62,000 patients across 7 different sites, and it works. It works. So you didn't have a very good, let me rephrase that, you didn't have a very representative or diverse data set to begin with, but it turns out you didn't need it in this case, at least for that particular outcome. So that's going to really complicate our concerns and our answer to this question. Do you really need a representative, whatever that means, data set, or will any brain do? That's a scientific, partially scientific question. So there's a lot of, and I just saw some of the awesome construction of imaging, new imaging software and hardware and devices that's going on in these buildings. You know, you grab someone, you just got to see if the thing turns on. You just have to see if someone's, do you need to run 100 subjects? No, probably not. When is a brain just a brain, just a brain? So the obvious but should be stated answer, it depends on the question being investigated. This is lost when you see a headline that says, we're interested in only having representative data sets. You need to move to, again, for what? Answer number one, it depends. You do not always need, however you want to define it, a diverse and representative data set. That is, the 5 people who walk down your hallway and you pull them in to do your thing may be enough for the thing you're doing. But I want to complicate that because it, I think, depends on more than just the scientific question. And here's a hypo to get us thinking about that. So I'm a law professor by training, and we love hypotheticals. And here is one. So let's say this is a silly one, but it'll make my point. So all 3 professors want to do the same thing. They want an algorithm that will predict whether a human can jump 10 feet off the ground. I picked that. I cherry-picked my question. You'll see why. So X recruits the first 30 people they see. And because X happens to work in a diverse city, there are multiple race ethnicities in the 30 participants. So X discovers that 0 out of 30 that they just found can jump 10 feet off the ground. And now they have an algorithm that works perfectly for every person, every human, everywhere. You come in, my algorithm will predict that you cannot jump 10 feet off the ground. And you'll try and you won't. Works. All right, so what about Y and Z? Well, they come to the same conclusion. Their algorithm works perfectly, just as well as X's. Which by one version of our approach to bias would say, okay, that's all we needed, right? Because so long as the thing works in the end, it really didn't matter how we got there. Isn't that what you just said with your breast mammogram example? Yeah, but see if you like this. So Y also recruits the first 30 people that come down, but they're not in a very diverse city, so it just happens to be all white. And Z does work in a diverse place, but for whatever reason, Z only accepts white people into their study, turns everyone else away. I'm guessing your gut reaction is you don't like Professor Z. You don't want to work in Professor Z's lab. Professor Z will just tell you, there's no bias in my lab. Look at what we produced. An algorithm that works just as well as every other one. So in law, we talk about this as procedural justice. That is, the way that you arrived at your algorithm or your neuroimaging technology might also matter. It's not just the outcome, it's the procedures by which you get there. And you'd want to think about what procedures are being used to engage the public or potential participants, and are we satisfied with those procedures? Okay. Here's another problem that's related but different, which is, or let's say that we want to get together and we say, we're about to launch a larger study. This isn't just people walking down the hallway. We can go out and get participants. Who do we want to get? Somebody says, hey, you know, I've been hearing, I think the funder wants, I think we need to have a representative data set. Great, okay, all right, let's go. And why do we want a representative data set? Well, because if one of the groups that we care about isn't in the data, it might be unfair to them. Right? That's the general logic. The problem is which groupings matter for the purpose of your analysis, and from procedural justice standpoint, what signal do you send when you're not paying attention to certain groups? So the first thing, it is impractical, impossible, and I think not appropriate to try and assess fairness by every conceivable grouping and dimension along which humans can be grouped, which just again makes our job more difficult, because even if you restricted it to, say, what we call in the law protected classes, these are the questions you can't be asked or ask in an interview setting, things like sexual orientation, marital status, disability. Okay, even if we restricted to those, that's too many. And no study I've ever seen, and I bet no study ever, will somehow be perfectly grouped along all these dimensions, even if they could be, right? And they'd be fine, because they would say, well, it just doesn't matter. I don't care if anyone's married or not. All right, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Does it matter? Then you say, well, I have all white people, but it doesn't matter. So those are tough questions, right? That need to be thought through, and I'm going to make them even harder. So here's the subgroup problem. We're writing on this in my lab. So imagine you start with this training data. You know, the people coming in for the neuroimaging study. We all think this is bad. The world is made up of 5 groups, A, B, C, and D. It's the entire world. And this is the percent of population, 20, 30, 30, 10, 10. But in your study, you've got 80% group A and nobody in group B. That's bad. So you're in that huddle. You're like, okay, we need to do better. We need some less group A and more group B. So you work really hard. And by gosh, you did it. Now you have training data that looks exactly like the world, right? You've matched all of your groups. So, congrats, yay, get a cake. Because it seems like you've done well, or have you? The problem is that the world isn't so neatly compartmentalized. Every group has subgroups. So group E is actually E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5. For instance, all of your Asian participants, which is one of the categories that's reported, are from one country. Or if they were from one country, there are multiple subgroups within those countries. Now this raises the question, how do you know if a subgroup is relevant or meaningful in your context? It might be just fine, or it might not matter at all. We're back to where we started. And you can't keep going down this path because E1 has subgroups and E5 is like E5A and E5B. And if you go all the way down, you'll get to the individual, and you're not putting 300 million people in your study. That's the whole point of grouping. So here are questions that typically have to be asked. How do you know if a subgroup is relevant, meaningful in your context? I think the answer is both scientific and social. It's scientific first and foremost, because again, you look at the literature, you look at theoretics, it's like, it just should not matter. So long as these are adult, then nothing else matters. Or maybe you say, as long as you're adult females, nothing else matters. Whatever your scientific question is. But context, of course, also includes social context. So you might look around where the center is located or where a research thing is happening and say, maybe we want to be deliberately including these because we have additional values that we want to, and because it would still be inconsistent, it's consistent with our scientific mandate, but we do additional things because we have additional mandates as well. Level of granularity, the same. These questions are they ever purely a question, or should some of these additional considerations be? All right, so that's just to stir the pot a little bit. But the reality is that most data, most results coming from most neuroimaging studies, so we change it, so I'll get to that at the end, are not derived from, however you want to, whatever definition you want to use for representative, they ain't representative. That is, they're convenient samples. They're drawn from sample populations or groups of participants that have, signed up for the MGH list, who happen to just float by the Facebook on college campuses for psychology studies. They are still, students who answered the bell. And it is not the case that, all these steps were carefully taken. People just did the research. So what do you do when you've got those things coming out and there's no time machine to go back? You've got this awesome, amazing study, or you've got awesome, amazing technology, but it didn't meet that representative bar. Well, you've got, so first, why does this happen? You may know that, and what are our contexts? One, that your lack of representation is known. That is, you're trying to be transparent and rigorous, and you report, and you just say, look, this is who participated in our study, this produced the results. It could be that you don't know because you didn't measure the variables, or we don't know because those variables weren't measured. It could be that the researcher developer won't share the data, proprietary, or for some other reason not shared. And there are a lot of reasons this could happen, not all bad. And some people just might not know, right? Because this isn't the sort of training one gets when developing these studies. You're focused on getting the science right. It could be a deliberate choice to minimize cost/capacity constraints. It is, if you're a startup company, you can only pay for X number. And you've just taken your second home mortgage and you've put it all into this in your pilot data. You'd love to have 10,000 more subjects. You can't. And then this is used a lot as an explanation. It's only pilot work. We'll get to the more bigger stuff later. This is actually this last one, the focus of the grant. I'll talk about at the end. All right, so whatever the reasons, kind of whatever the situation, you have three options. So one is just ignore the fact. And this has basically been, neuroscience research and AI research up until the last, last little reckoning, 3, 5, 7 years. I don't think that's appropriate. I'll say why. Proceed with caution is what I think the right answer is, which is to acknowledge these maybe constraints, but move forward. And then some would say, well, go back to the drawing board. You can't use it all until you've got, again, whatever that representative bar is. In the interest of time, there's not really, it is sort of like, what does that mean? We could talk about it in a particular context, but I'll say a few more words there. All right, so I'm planting some seeds of the types of questions that I hope this community might be asking. But let me, in the next 15, show you a little bit about neuroethics in action. So I'll do 2 case studies. The first case study has to do with portable MRI. And this is the image from the Science magazine article that came out this past week, featuring Dr. Rosen's Hyperfine. It's also on the door of the office, so you can see it there. So Dr. Rosen's been working on that for how many years do you think it took to get to there? Was like 2001, 2000, even before? I guess you could go back to lineage, but that's 2001. So we came on a little late to the game, but at least 5 years before we were anticipating that this would happen. Right? And by we, I mean, I'll show you our group of ethical and legal scholars, along with neuroscientists, and say, all right, this new world of MRI is coming. It's going to raise, of course, a lot of new clinical and scientific possibilities, but also raises some real deep ethical and legal questions. And instead of ending up with a slide like this, you're just like, well, yeah, just kind of be cautious about it. What does it actually look like to work through a problem and develop some solutions? All right, so let me show you at least the approach we take. So you might say, is neuroethics just sitting around and asking tough questions like I just did? No, it is not. It's about doing hard work. It takes time, and thank you to Matt for being on many of these calls. You can see more about this particular work at neuroimagingethics.org. It takes these teams of people who bring really diverse perspectives. This is our group, neuroscientists, physicists, clinicians, ethicists, legal scholars, and thanks to NIH for funding it. So we started by identifying, what's really going to change, at a high level. So you're going to get brain scans for everyone, including vulnerable populations. You're going to allow a whole bunch of other people, anyone can cook. So like, no, anyone can scan, and not quite anyone, and depends what you mean by scanning, but like anyone in this room for sure, but anyone in my law school class also, right? Because they're smart enough to work the iPad and adjust things. And then brain scans everywhere. And we do actually already have home delivery of that. Sean Dione at Brown is taking this van around and doing home visits. You get not just the Hyperfine device, but others devices, including another Martinos device on the tabletop scanner from the Walls group, and others, the Garber device, and more. And this stuff is showing up, right? So I mentioned the Scanavan from Professor Dione. It is, as you said, we want to do MRI house calls, and they're already doing that. I talked to Sean recently, and it was interesting, in terms of participant recruitment, your nosy neighbor who, like, anything happens, so he has nosy neighbors. He'll do that. They'll go to one house, the nosy neighbor, and someone will walk over, and by the end, they're getting scanned because they want to have it, right? Completely different way of recruiting and engagement, which opens up some real possibilities, but obviously some ethical issues as well. I love this quote. This was being delivered outside the US to a resource limited place. We needed to construct a whole building for our first MRI. This one fits in a cupboard. It's also in an ambulance. I talked with this team a few months ago in South Carolina. They've got connecting this with their teleneurology team, time is brain and stroke and reasons. So this stuff is happening, and there are a lot of reasons to be excited. And I want to emphasize on this slide, again, my theme from the beginning, the neuroethics engagement isn't about like just identifying the horror stories, and isn't about just stopping all this and slowing progress. It is also to unleash the really cool, awesome stuff, which includes brain scans at much greater convenience, increasing access, which is a major issue both for research and clinical practice, monitoring participants much more closely in real-world environments, real-time interventions, more objective data, greater frequency, et cetera. But there are also concerns. And so you identify and then you try and address those. And I can't share with you our consensus guidance because we're like this close, but and Matt might be laughing, we're working on the wording, we're working on which turns out to be really thorny. Like, for example, data ownership. Do participants own their data or not? And the trajectory we encourage, you could imagine going to. But let me just give you a couple of examples. So staffing and standards. Yes, anyone could operate the machine. Just because anyone can drive a car doesn't mean everyone should. And there are licensing requirements, right? And there are some real dangers here. How do you communicate with participants? How do you handle incidental findings? This is something that I'll mention at the end, and thanks to Susie for being here. We're trying to think about This could be a great tool for recruitment and engagement. It could also be an exploitative tool for helicopter research. Because you can imagine, you don't have to name any names, but some colleagues I know would see this and think, I see my next science article, because I'm going to be the first to be out there with totally diverse. I'm going to take this awesome study I have. Let's get it out there. Let's get that data, right? By the way, that's exactly not the way to do community engaged research, but it is the way to speedily get a science publication or Nature, right? So what are the sorts of issues that we've identified and raised? Again, I can't go into all of them, but I just want to flag them. Rethinking informed consent on site, issues around privacy, everything from just like, we can scan in the corner. So suddenly all of us can be the nosy neighbors, but also data privacy along the continuum. The role of algorithms, research incidental findings. This is one of our images from before where we contrasted kind of, everything happens in a box here. You want to be scanned, it's like the MJ environment, it's the hospital environment. You unleash this stuff and it's suddenly data's flowing everywhere, people are everywhere, the scanners are everywhere. How do you handle that? For a separate talk, we had more time to talk about how this might play out in international settings. I just flagged that our working group there, which is a previous project, really focused on co-creation of knowledge. It's like the antithesis of helicopter research. It does take time. It doesn't necessarily have to slow the research, right? It means that you need to have an adjustment of priorities and sort of working through these issues. I'll just flag, I guess, a couple of them. So across the path, you've got these large priorities, right? Local partnerships, sustained local engagement. How do you create that? You work with these communities. And then thinking about, again, this pathway, right? It's this continuum of care, because you're suddenly going to have, whether it's exponential or not, it's certainly a very large number of scans showing up, which means you're going to read all those scans. And if you do read those, you're going to have a bunch of incidental findings. You have incidental findings of people who are not just able to send up 3 floors to see someone. They're in a place where they can't get to a hospital. They're in a place where they don't understand, right? That infrastructure, we need to think about that before you jump into this work, right? And go hand in hand. So our current goal, and we're really towards the end of this project, this large NIH brain project, is to generate these evidence-based consensus recommendations. Like I almost thought I might have them today when I agreed to do this talk. I was looking at our time, like maybe I'll have the 13. We are close, but I just don't want to share them because I don't want to we're going to adjust them slightly. But I can tell you that these recommendations, which will get published and then further spun off, we think in partnership with the appropriate professional organizations, ISMRM, ACR, et cetera, really can define this new generation of imaging. All right, so let me give you one other quick example, which comes from digital phenotyping, which can include all this digital phenotyping. I'd include imaging as part of that. This is with colleagues at McLean Hospital, Scott Rauch and Justin Baker and Ben Silverman, and we got an article coming out. It's in proofs right now with a cast of thousands that looks at neurotech research, again, including neuroimaging, but also smartphones, ambient sensors in psychiatry. And the basic idea is you get more and more data, real time, real world, including also bringing people in with imaging. You analyze that through AI and ML, you get improved clinical outcomes. Now, I don't know if you saw the demise of Mindstrong. That was sort of the company that was going to do this at scale for profit, and it didn't quite work. So there are big leaps. A lot of research is needed, and we're thinking about how do you do that research ethically. Of course, you need technical validation, clinical validation, regulatory approval. But we've focused, and for purpose of just flagging one issue, how do you do this research with the humans involved? We've thought about this idea of computational justice. We flagged, again, these issues of specific to brain. It's the most intimate of our data. Right? The issues raise really deep questions around justice and bias, and we've been doing that. So we set up one scenario, and this is another example of sort of how do you work through these issues before they show up, is you get the right group together, you anticipate what's going to happen, and then you develop a plan to deal with that. And this particular plan had to do with return of results. So return of results traditionally have been you run your study, you get all your analysis, and then maybe you send something back to the participants. But return of results in real-time work is really different, because you can suddenly, if you're doing daily monitoring using smartphone, you could send that alert daily, weekly, monthly. You're combining that with a bunch of other things, and you've got a lot of issues in terms of when and how you return those. Looking at this clock, I'll just flag that the the mobile answer is no default presumption, but it's a balance of risk. For instance, low risk is just say step count data off the phone. Maybe high benefit because they're like, yeah, they're really trying to stick with their step count. Or return that as part of your research study. Give them some benefit, right? Maybe akin to giving someone just a structural brain scan at the end. You're like, yeah, that was fun. You get this brain scan. Unknown benefit and high risk would be you're trying to use a combination, which by the way, Mindstrong was, of digital data and biological data to predict the onset of dementia. But your model's not ready yet. It'd be really high risk to send back your red flag to this individual because it's going to cause all kind of concern. It might lead to hospital visits. And then you're like 2 years later, hey, I remember that model, forgot to tweak it a little bit. Actually, you're okay. But on the other hand, maybe it could have saved their life if the model was ready, right? So these are the sorts of things that we try and work through. And the most important thing to just drive home when we think about like the who, what, where, what, and how is that you get to those answers by engaging your patient and participant community, right? You don't just have to sit here and think about, well, what would they want? I wonder what those participants want. Ask them, engage them, right? All right. So the deeper you go, the more you know. But with timely concerted action, that's what neuroethics is, you can get ahead of these things. And if we had time, there's a lot of other juicy stuff I've mentioned, because neuroimaging is used in lie detection, brain death, neurosurgery with it, pain and law, neuromarketing, all kinds of other stuff that we won't talk about now. So let me finish up with some thoughts about kind of concrete things, like what do you do towards solutions? So I've got 4 ideas, and I'm really glad Susie's here because the last slide is about a grant that I hope we get. So first is, these are complicated issues. Just be honest about them and genuine and transparent. That might mean if you're doing human neuroimaging research to report on the demographics of your data. It might mean in some other context, simply, even if it's internally for the lab, writing out how it is that the lab views its values and how it implements them. If it's relevant to the work, and this is more for less the developing and for those who are actually running human subjects, it might be useful to think about whether it makes sense to measure certain subgroups or not. Again, that's a combination of a scientific and a cultural and ethical question, but you at least maybe give yourself a chance on measuring that data. Talking through the complexity of the issue, that's what we're doing now, and then real community engagement. So I'll come back to that in a second. All right, so these are tough, to get into granular data. If you were doing a study like all of us, the NIH study, maybe you know of this, is millions of people enrolled. Well, they have the benefit of sitting there and talking with participants. It's the whole study is to ask this granular level of detail. If you're in different contexts, let's say you're doing critical medicine. So I'm involved, and I mentioned that because I'll talk about in a second, an NIH Bridged AI project where they're trying to use electronic health record data. Someone has a broken leg, they're being rushed into the hospital. The idea is that maybe AI data, eventually AI models could take all that data and figure out, to improve patient care. Someone with a broken leg doesn't want to walk through the complexities of ethnicity and race with you on intake. Okay? It's impossible. So it really depends. However, at the same time, it's hard to know if you don't have more granular data than sort of traditional hospital systems. We're trying to sort of navigate that. This is a very concrete, practical problem that we're handling. We're working on it this week and these years. This is the particular team. Eric Rosenthal at MGH is big boss on this project. And the overall goal in that project for Dr. Rosenthal is patient-focused collaborative hospital repository uniting standards. The basic idea is these multi-center data sets, right? So they're trying to data standards and align across 14 different units. And we're thinking about the complexities of doing that with variables like race and gender and ethnicity. And it's really hard because here are just 4 of the sites. So they measure gender differently. They measure ethnicity differently. They're just different categories and different options. In one group, they measure race differently here. There's a lot of different options. And ethnicity, one group has over 150 options. Others groups have just like 5. So how do you do that? Well, it's sort of similar, right? You realistically think about the context of critical care medicine, of a health record, and you think about how is that data fidelity and that data quality, how can be ensured. And I'll just flag for you 2 things. One is that there have been studies that will take the same patient who gets admitted to 2 different hospitals, and they look at the race of the patient as reported in hospital 1 and hospital 2. And it's not, it is correlated, of course, but it's not the same often. Why? Because the way that this stuff is measured is like this. I'm on intake, I look over, I see the box, or down Epic, of course, I'm clicking. Okay, black, right? It'd be akin to, instead of putting someone on the scale to weigh them, it's just like, I guess like probably 140, 145. Right? We wouldn't stand for that, that lack of specificity. Now, this is harder to measure than putting someone on a scale, but the thought needs to go in. All right, this is what we're doing right now, by the way. So you already can check off number 3, feel good about that. And number 4, community engagement. Okay, so that's been the thread from the beginning through the end for this, which is that when you've got really tough, vexing issues like this, and it's not as simple as just putting someone on a scale. The literature, and certainly my belief, is that it would be folly to think that we at Martinos or at Harvard or University of Minnesota, where I've been for the last 10 years, could know all the answers. So I think participant engagement is really important. Now, the best practice is really robust, thoughtful, longitudinal engagements. Worst practice is none at all, but there's a concerning practice, and that's engagement as cover or checkbox. I was just talking, I did a listening session last night with young people who are trying to get into the tech field, and they talked about it as this way. They said, and this young man, I really appreciate his comments, that if I want to work for a company, I don't look at the social media post of the company, because they always have this great, welcome to so-and-so, we're so thrilled you've joined our diverse team. He looks at the LinkedIn post of people who work at that company and says, if someone on their own posted about the company, that's what he trusts. This illusion of engagement, I think, is quite possible and problematic. So we've been trying to do work around this area. We've got a project that just ended yesterday, a pilot project around neurotech justice. This is for participants in our summit. Really trying to think about the trajectory of neuroscience. We've been out in the public out at the Museum of Science. And then the one I want to dive in a little bit, this last few slides, is engagement. That we play this game called Neurofutures, where whether it's kids or adults, and this is one of our fellows, you try and think about their values with respect to some of these big technologies. We took that same game just down the road. I don't know if any of you have heard of this bookstore called More Than Words here in Boston. They're also in Waltham. So it's a great bookstore, but it's also a social enterprise group that works with youth age 16 to 24, all of whom are systems involved. Most or all have been involved at some point in criminal justice systems. There's housing insecurity issues, a number of challenges. And these are the sorts of individuals and groups and communities that don't usually get to be a part of the conversations like we're having here today. So we went through and we played the same game, and they had great ideas and great thoughts, and we worked through what would a report card for neurotech developers look like? What would you want to know about this technology? And they said things like, we want to know the side effects. We want to know, like, who'd you test it on? We want to know, like, who are you? All these things. Really engaged. Now, here's the bad news for our group. There's a complete lack of trust. So we said, all right, here's what you want to know on the report card. Who do you trust to answer those questions, right? And the most common response was, we don't trust anyone. And the reason they don't trust anyone is they don't have any reason to trust anyone. We started listing them because what they've seen are people, if they, as one quote said, nobody comes to do research in the hood. That was the direct quote. And if they do, said somebody else, it's just because they just want to, like, basically use them. So there's a real there's a real barrier. It's not that we didn't uncover this. It's like in the literature, left and right, but it confirms that right here in Boston, we have this challenge. So how do you address it? Well, I'm really excited that, and I'm told Matt that I don't like to count anything till it's actually funded, but I hope, Susanna, I hope we have a good chance of getting this funded. And let me just, so it's about Martinos, so thanks to Dr. Rosen, Bruce, and to Susie and everyone who's involved, there are others. The Center for Access, Recruitment, and Engagement is also an MGH group led by Jonathan Jackson, and then us over at the Center for Bioethics. We have proposed to NIH Brain this project called Improving Recruitment, Engagement, Access, Community Health Equity, and Brain, Next Generation Human Neuroimaging Research and Beyond, Reach for Brain. And the basic idea is that we will address these trust issues. Jonathan has a wonderful framework they've been using for the last few years, Black and Brown Boston, to really think about engagement in communities, to develop over this series of years, over the course of the grant, co-develop and then actually implement community-led, participant-centered, participatory strategies, right? So it's not just looking at the paper and trying to increase the number in certain categories so you can feel better about what we report to NIH, but really foundationally, fundamentally shifting the way that business as usual operates, and doing that in partnership with the community. And the idea would be that we do this, and we're also conscious of like all the issues that I'm just raising. Like it's not as easy as just putting people on a scale. These are, you don't even know how to define race, how to define diversity, how to define justice. So I hope that gets funded, and then I can give a very different talk. Susie can join us, and so can Jonathan, and a lot of the others at Martinos, many of you in the coming years. All right, so I'll end where I started, which is Neuroethics Street is not scary. You should come join us sometime. It actually can, I think, really bolster your work. And I want to give credit to NIH Brain, which now often requires for certain of their research requirement, RFPs, a neuroethics component. So, you know, my answer is that yes, I think Martinos really can become the leader in the neuroethics of neuroimaging, and students especially, you know, come get involved, and I'll stop sharing there. They leave 10 minutes, so pretty good.
Very much. It was really great talk. Thank you very much. And you know, yeah, Bruce, please.
Mm-hmm.
What can we?
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, I mean, others in the room, but thankfully we do have this, I hope, this grant that will get through. And the idea, we actually had put in, Susie, remember this, a pilot grant supplement. And the idea was that we could plant a bunch of seeds over here at Martinos and then go in for the bigger grant. We went right for the big grant, so that's good. So I think there are a couple of things. One is, and most importantly, is being open to doing things differently. And we've really focused on the, excuse me, I'd love to hear your thoughts actually. So these are my thoughts on the human neuroimaging research component. Those who are enrolling and participants are going to come. And it does take time. I mean, that's the thing, like, it's not an easy thing. It's not just like a DEI training where you show up for 2 hours, you've done it, and then you can, it is a sustained engagement. And so one, being open to doing things differently, and then two, actually showing up. I mean, one of the coolest things about going to More Than Words, and we've worked with them before, is that although the youth say they don't trust anyone, they don't, they trusted us enough to let us come back again. And they want us to come back. And like, and Jonathan Jackson could speak much more eloquently on this, and that's why he's at the center of this grant. But I think that's the core. And then I would say a third thing is help us think scientifically on those science questions, right? Because the field, I think the field needs that. To me, the field of neuroimaging is a lot like these other fields, like AI especially, where the headlines to me are completely useless. The headline story being, we need fair and represent, you know, we can't have biased data. Okay, I mean, yeah, but like, what do you mean by that? And if we could have some clarification on that, I think it would be a big statement to the field. I haven't seen that statement yet. I've seen like business as usual, which is like ignore it, just like do stuff. I've seen the other spectrum, which is basically, I don't even know exactly what it is, but I think it's an undefined, good impetus kind of emphasis on a lot of the issues without some practical knowledge. So that's where I'd come from. But I think this grant would be the single thing, since we hopefully would do it. So Susie, what do you think? Did you say more? Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because we've started doing that with some of the others. We actually have a small, I didn't talk about it, small grant from the Dana Foundation to do just that, which is that, neuroethics isn't usually a part of, it's a very busy schedule. I mean, you have to train in all these other things too, but trying to integrate that and also trying to get the neuroethics outward because no one's ever heard of these. I had never heard of this field until I happened to have someone in my network mention this like over a decade ago. And so those networks get pretty insular also.
Sort of the issue. We don't have
I think it's very difficult. So you think you're talking like scientific? Yeah. So one thing that's why I wanted to give credit to NIH Brain is you put it in the scored criteria. That's the main thing. I think it's probably by far the most important thing because incentives have to be aligned. But I will say like a 1B thing is that it's kind of like with a lot of things. If people could just experience it, then they will, because I mean, you guys are all brain people. We make decisions not based on our emotions, right? This is how decision making works. And I think if we can get people in the room, we can convince them. Just like fundraising, people's like, just get me in the door, and they'll walk out. So to me, those are the two things. And maybe a third, which is you plant the seed early. So this is actually, I think, what you're saying that the training programs could incorporate more. That third one we are doing. We have some control over that. The funding mechanisms, that's just tough. So I think having realistic expectations is important too. I know my friends in industry they really struggle, I think, at times with their personal commitments and the fact that they also believe in the mission of the company. Live in Boston and rent is high, and it's like they can't be the one to stop and say. So I don't have any answers beyond that, but I do think those are the first steps. Yeah. Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I guess yes and no. I think that yes, in the sense that the idea is that this is a pilot project with Connectome Scanner to try and work out a model that could be expanded. The only no part is that I don't think the expansion will ever look like it's just, oh yeah, we need more diverse prisoners, so that's the group down the hall that does the diversity stuff. So we're going to knock on their door, and then they're going to help us get diverse participants. It can't work that way. I mean, it could work that way. That wouldn't be a very good way for it to work. So I think the model will actually be to have engagement of the research team from the conception of the study, and to have realistic expectations, and then to move from there. But it's going to be very difficult, challenging work, I anticipate. So.
It's just a second. I know a lot of patients, but
granted, we really many populations, but then failed to follow later on. So it's, we're going to get 50% diverse population, really great from the NIH. Then when it actually comes down to it, well, we got 10% diverse population, but well, we tried that. Kind of putting something in that way in the center line to, accountable for meeting the goals that your thoughts,
Yeah, I think that the setting a goal has to be attached to establishing and communicating a mechanism for reaching that goal. And I'm trying to see if I can share, let's see if I can put this in real-time change of slides, if I can do it. Yeah, I can. Let me rotate this. So this is from Jonathan Jackson's work, rotate all the way around. And again, if you don't know the care group, well, slightly in interest of time, I'm not going to try and do it. But the point is simply that the top line is hard to read, but it says systemic barriers, inputs, activities, outputs, contact phase, partner phase, communication phase. This is a method that their center, so this is the care center method that they have used effectively in other contexts and that we propose to NIH. So it like I said, it's really, I guess it's enough to share it. Just to say and illustrate that it is very difficult to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve. And so it's not surprising to me that one might have a goal of enrolling, however it's defined, a diverse group of participants and then not reach it. Because just visually see, it's not just like, oh, we just do X, Y, and Z and then boom, right? It's starting with the systemic barriers, which I would describe as what, when I go back to Northern Waters in a couple of weeks, it's like it's a very different world. But the other thing is that there's no reason that they can't be, the groups like them couldn't be fully engaged in this sort of work. And that's just one of like many, many groups who just never even, like no one's ever showed up and knocked on the door, So that's my response, I guess, is that it's really got the methods. And it's going to take a while. Like that's why we have take 3-4 years. And we're relying on, I wish Jonathan were here, he could talk more about it. This is an awesome place. I know there are other efforts going on in MGH also, in other offices. So we're not trying to, we can build on stuff.
We have 2 questions from online audience. The first question is, how will you create or find those stakeholders groups for your proposed study?
So in this particular grant, we were lucky that, and are building on work that Care Center's already done. And they've spent through other pilot grants, years establishing those stakeholder networks. For our other ones, for our neurotech justice group, where we're just building them, we relied on sort of more grassroots efforts. Like we're doing right now an effort where we are identifying hundreds of minority serving institutions, and we are going through. I've got a team of students helping me. Everyone, we go to the psychology department, the relevant department. We're finding the student groups, and we're emailing them about this and like, hey, would you want to come do a Zoom about this? And we'll grab 2 of them. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. The other question, issues like representation and bias can clearly occur in animal models data as well.
Yeah, non-human animal models, yeah.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts about what aspects of neuroethics would be weighted or considered differently when working with animals?
I think sex has been the place in non-human animal models that has generated the most. Sex and age, actually, I'd say are the 2.
Yeah.
That's my 30-second answer. Well, sorry, sex, age, and whether you should do it at all. And I think the Wall Street Journal, New York Times just ran another story about how we treat rats.
Yeah.
And basically just been an uneasy sort of assumption that I can be vegan, but also be in a lab that does these things to mice.
Yeah.
And at some point that won't continue. In our lifetime, there's going to be like that's going to be revisited.
Yeah.
But not today, not this talk, but that's
yeah. I have one, actually. I've been trying to go in. So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but how do you think the actual issues about, for example, ethnicity in different international contexts could be worked? Because, for example, in Germany, you cannot ask people's ethnicity. I mean, it's actually illegal to ask, for example.
Yeah, so I think it's very context specific. So race doesn't mean as much in some countries as it does here in the United States. And this actually came up recently. And so I think it's up for debate. And I had more slides, I show it. There's a Twitter feed involving Dr. Jackson, who is really concerned about using self-reported race at all.
Yeah.
And would advise something like Ancestry. And there are others who are great colleagues who argue, no, we absolutely have to use it. So, like I said, it's really different than just getting accurate measurements on a scale. You want accurate measurements, but you don't know the thing you're measuring, which makes it even more complicated. But it can be addressed, and you can give reasons, and that's the answer to me. That's why it's a reflexive practice. It's not just here's the answer. It's okay. Think about why you've arrived at your decision and say that, and then others can. And that's what we do in science or in any area of activity. You can push back and say, but at least you know why someone has done something or why they have.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Very good.
Okay.
And see you next week for the audience.